The mahogany table stretched before us like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the faces of my family members who had gathered for what would become the most devastating moment of my life. I sat in the corner chair, the one nobody wanted, closest to the drafty window, furthest from Father's empty leather armchair that still smelled of his old spice cologne and pipe tobacco. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long shadows across the drawing room that had witnessed decades of family celebrations and arguments. Today, it would witness something far worse: the systematic destruction of everything I'd believed about my place in this family. My sister Charlotte adjusted her black Chanel suit and shot me a sideways glance, her lips curling into that familiar smirk I'd known since childhood. She'd always been the golden child, the one who remembered to send birthday cards and visit every Sunday for roast dinner with all the trimmings. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in a chignon, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She looked like she was attending a business meeting rather than our father's will reading. I was the black sheep who'd moved to Manchester for university and only came home for Christmas. Sometimes not even then, if I was chasing a story in some far-flung corner of the world. My dark suit was wrinkled from the overnight train journey, my shoes scuffed from years of running down leads and camping outside courthouses. We couldn't have looked more different if we'd tried. Mr. Pemberton, our family solicitor who'd known us since we were children, cleared his throat and opened the burgundy folder containing Father's last will and testament. His hands shook slightly, whether from age or the gravity of the moment I couldn't tell. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of village life carrying on as if nothing monumental was about to happen. Mum dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed she'd applied fresh mascara that morning, waterproof no doubt. She'd dressed carefully too, in her navy blue dress with the pearl brooch Father had given her for their silver anniversary. Even in grief, she maintained the standards of respectability that had defined our household for as long as I could remember. Cousin Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably wondering why he'd been summoned to witness this family moment. Uncle Robert, Father's younger brother, sat ramrod straight in his military bearing, though retirement had softened his edges somewhat. Aunt Helen picked at her black gloves, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. "Before we begin," Mr. Pemberton said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles that had slipped down his nose, "I must say your father was very particular about his final wishes. He made several revisions to this document over the past year. Several revisions." I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps Father had recognized my efforts after all, my attempts to make a name for myself in journalism, to fight for stories that mattered even when they didn't pay well. Charlotte leaned forward, her manicured fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that seemed almost predatory. She owned a successful boutique in the village center, selling expensive clothes to wives of wealthy businessmen and politicians. She'd always lived within Father's expectations, following the path he'd laid out for the perfect daughter. Perfect marriage to a barrister named Richard. Perfect house on Elm Street with the white picket fence and rose garden. Perfect social standing in the community. I, on the other hand, was a struggling freelance journalist who'd chosen passion over profit, integrity over inheritance, or so I'd thought. My flat in Manchester was a cramped bedsit above a fish and chip shop. My car was held together with duct tape and prayer, and my bank account balanced precariously between assignments. As Mr. Pemberton began reading the preliminary statements about legal formalities and tax implications, Charlotte caught my eye and leaned closer. The scent of her expensive perfume, something French and floral, filled the space between us. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words cut through me like shards of glass. "You're not getting anything." The certainty in her voice made my stomach drop like a stone thrown into a deep well. Had she known something I didn't? Had Father really written me out completely? I thought about all those missed Sunday dinners, all those phone calls that went straight to voicemail when I was chasing stories across Europe. The pharmaceutical corruption scandal in Romania, the human trafficking investigation in Prague, the environmental disaster cover-up in Wales, all stories that had mattered, stories that had made a difference, but stories that had kept me away from family obligations. Maybe I'd pushed him too far with my absence. Maybe my pursuit of truth and justice had cost me the very thing I'd been fighting to make him proud of. The irony was crushing. I'd spent years trying to live up to his values of integrity and moral courage, only to discover that what he'd really wanted was my physical presence at Sunday lunch. Charlotte's smirk widened as she watched the realization dawn on my face. She'd always been competitive, even as children, but this felt different. This felt calculated, deliberate, cruel in a way that spoke to years of planning and resentment. Have you ever felt that moment when your world starts crumbling, but you have to sit perfectly still and pretend everything's fine? That's exactly where I found myself, surrounded by family who suddenly felt like strangers, watching my sister savor what she clearly saw as her moment of ultimate victory. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking the hour that would divide my life into before and after. Before I learned how little I'd mattered to the man who'd raised me to fight for what was right. And after, well, that remained to be seen. Mr. Pemberton's voice droned on about property valuations and tax implications, whilst my mind raced through every conversation I'd had with Father over the past 5 years. Had I really been that absent, that ungrateful? I tried to remember the last time we'd spoken properly, not just the hurried phone calls where I'd update him on my latest assignment whilst rushing to catch a flight or meet a deadline. There had been that conversation about the Guardian piece on NHS funding cuts. He'd seemed proud then, hadn't he? Or was I projecting what I'd wanted to hear onto his polite responses? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I'd really known about his feelings towards my career choices. To my beloved wife Margaret, Mr. Pemberton continued, I leave the family home at 42 Rosemary Lane and all contents thereof, along with my personal savings account, currently containing approximately £67,000. Mum's face crumpled with relief, tears streaming down her cheeks in rivulets that carved tracks through her carefully applied foundation. At least she was secure. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, and I'd never questioned that it would remain hers until her final days. To my daughter Charlotte Elizabeth, who has been the light of my life and my constant companion through these recent difficult years, I bequeath my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately £400,000, as well as my 50% share in Hartwell & Associates, the property development firm, £400,000, plus half ownership of a business I'd had no idea Father was involved in. Charlotte's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, but she maintained her mask of appropriate solemnity. She reached over and squeezed Mum's hand, playing the part of the devoted daughter perfectly. I noticed her wedding ring, a family heirloom that had belonged to our grandmother, another piece of our history that had apparently been promised to her without my knowledge. The business partnership explained so much. No wonder Charlotte had been able to afford that boutique, that house, that lifestyle that had always seemed slightly beyond her means. Father had been supporting her ambitions whilst I'd been scraping together rent money and living on instant noodles between assignments. Additionally, Mr. Pemberton continued, Charlotte shall receive my collection of antique silver, my grandmother's jewelry collection, and the cottage in the Lake District. The cottage. My chest tightened with memory. I'd spent every summer there as a child, learning to swim in the lake, building tree houses in the ancient oak that overlooked the water. Charlotte had always complained about the isolation, the lack of shops and restaurants. She'd spent those summers reading fashion magazines and painting her nails, whilst I explored the fells and learned to identify birds with Father's old binoculars. Now it was hers too. And to my son, James. Mr. Pemberton paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. He removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, clearly buying time. "I leave my collection of first edition novels, my fishing equipment, and a personal letter to be read privately at his convenience." That was it. 43 years of being his son, reduced to some dusty books and a tackle box that hadn't been used in over a decade. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me as they processed the magnitude of my disinheritance. Charlotte didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. She actually smiled, not at me, but at Mum, as if they shared some private joke about my spectacular fall from grace. The smile was subtle, just a slight upturn of her lips, but it spoke volumes about how long she'd been anticipating this moment. The fishing rod. I almost laughed at the bitter irony. Father had taken me fishing exactly twice in my entire childhood. Both times, he'd spent more time on his mobile phone dealing with work calls than teaching me how to cast a line properly. I'd tangled the line in overhanging branches, lost more hooks than I'd care to admit, and never caught anything bigger than a minnow. But Charlotte? She'd never shown the slightest interest in fishing, had actively complained about the smell of bait and the early morning starts required for the best spots. Yet somehow, she'd inherited everything that mattered: the money, the property, the business interests, whilst I got the symbolic remnants of a relationship that had apparently never existed the way I'd imagined it. After the reading concluded with discussions of probate timelines and legal formalities, everyone milled about discussing practical matters in hushed tones. Uncle Robert approached me with genuine sympathy in his eyes, but what could he say? That he was sorry my father had chosen to exclude me from his legacy. That he'd always thought I was a good lad who deserved better. I found myself standing alone by Father's bookshelf, running my fingers along the spines of volumes he'd collected over a lifetime. Dickens, Hardy, Austen, all the classics he'd encouraged me to read as a boy. At least I'd have these, I thought, bitterly. These and the memories they contained of bedtime stories and rainy afternoon reading sessions that had shaped my love of language and storytelling. Charlotte approached, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown timer. She'd removed her jacket, revealing a silk blouse that probably cost more than I made in a month. Her confidence was palpable, radiating from her like heat from a fire. "Don't look so shocked, James," she said quietly, straightening a picture frame that showed the three of us at Christmas 5 years ago, the last time we'd all been together as a complete family. "You made your choices, moving away, missing Christmases, never calling unless you needed something. Did you really think you could just waltz back here and claim your share?" Her words stung because they contained enough truth to make me question myself. Had I only called when I needed something? I tried to remember conversations that weren't about borrowing money for equipment or asking for advice on stories. The memories were frustratingly vague. "I was building a career," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, the way I did when interviewing difficult subjects. I thought he understood that journalism was my calling, that I was making a difference in the world. Understanding and approving are two very different things. She adjusted her pearl necklace, another family piece I'd never seen before, probably something else that had been quietly promised to her over the years. Father valued loyalty above all else. He valued presence, commitment, reliability. You chose independence and adventure. This is what independence looks like when it comes at the cost of family. The casual cruelty in her voice was devastating, but what made it worse was the complete lack of malice. She wasn't being vindictive or emotional. She was simply stating facts as she saw them. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about belonging, about being valued, about family bonds that I'd apparently never understood properly. "He used to wait for your calls, you know," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "Every Sunday after lunch, he'd sit by the phone for hours, hoping you'd ring. Mum would make excuses for you, time differences, work commitments, travel schedules, but I could see it in his eyes, James. The disappointment, the gradual acceptance that his son had moved on to bigger and better things than his old man. And apparently, I'd failed that test spectacularly. The golden boy had turned out to be fool's gold, whilst the daughter I'd always thought of as shallow and materialistic had proven to be the reliable, constant presence our parents had needed in their declining years. 3 days later, I was alone in Father's study, packing his books into cardboard boxes I'd bought from the local post office. The house felt different without the bustle of family members coming and going, empty and echoing in a way that made every footstep sound like an intrusion. Mum had given me the weekend to collect my meager inheritance before the house clearance company arrived on Monday. Charlotte was busy with her solicitor, no doubt ensuring that every legal detail was properly handled to prevent any future challenges to her windfall. I handled each book carefully, remembering conversations we'd had about favorite authors and compelling characters. Father had been a voracious reader despite his business commitments, often staying up late into the night with a novel and a glass of whiskey. I'd inherited that love of literature from him, though I'd channeled it into journalism rather than leisure reading. It was when I was removing a particularly thick volume of Dickens' Great Expectations, how fitting, that I found it. A leather journal wedged behind the books, hidden from casual view but positioned where someone looking for it would eventually discover it. The journal was bound in rich brown leather, the kind that ages beautifully and develops character over time. Father's initials were embossed in gold on the cover, R.H.M., Robert Harold Matthews. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure whether I wanted to read what might be his private thoughts about his disappointing son. The pages were filled with Father's distinctive spidery handwriting, dated entries going back nearly 2 decades. Some entries were brief, noting business meetings or social engagements. Others were longer, more reflective pieces about life, family, regrets, and hopes for the future. I flipped to a random page and began reading, unprepared for what I would discover. 15th March, 2018. James called today from Prague. Another story about corruption in local government officials taking bribes from construction companies. He sounded tired but excited, the way he always does when he's onto something important. I'm proud of his integrity, though I wish he understood how much I miss him. Charlotte thinks I should cut off his allowance completely, says it will teach him responsibility and force him to come home. Perhaps she's right, but how do you stop supporting a son who's trying to make the world a better place? His work matters, even if it doesn't pay well. I had to stop reading and catch my breath. An allowance? What allowance? I'd never received any regular money from Father, had always struggled to make ends meet between assignments. Either he was confused or... I flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry that painted a completely different picture of our relationship than the one I'd lived through. 2nd June, 2019. Charlotte came for Sunday lunch again. She spent most of the time complaining about James's lifestyle choices and suggesting I revise my will to reflect reality, as she puts it. She thinks his absence shows a lack of commitment to family values. I don't like how she speaks about her brother, the cold calculation in her voice when she discusses his future. But Margaret says I should listen to her concerns. She is here, after all, present and accounted for, whilst James is chasing stories across continents. Perhaps presence should count for something. The words hit me like physical blows. Charlotte had been poisoning him against me, slowly but systematically, using my absence as a weapon, whilst positioning herself as the devoted daughter who deserved everything. But there were other entries that revealed an even more disturbing pattern. 14th September 2020 found Charlotte going through my desk again today. She claims she's helping me organize my papers, but I noticed several important documents were missing afterwards. When I asked her about them, she said she'd put them somewhere safe, but couldn't remember where. I'm beginning to think I need to be more careful about what I leave lying around. 3rd December 2020. My bank statements don't seem right. There are several withdrawals I don't remember making, all for amounts just under the threshold that would require additional verification. When I questioned the bank, they said the withdrawals were made using my card and PIN number. Charlotte is the only person who knows those details, as she's been helping me with online banking since my eyesight started failing. My heart raced as I read these revelations. Charlotte hadn't just been manipulating father emotionally, she'd been stealing from him systematically and carefully for years. But the most shocking entry was dated just 3 months before his death. 18th of January 2023. I've decided to change my will again to... Charlotte has been pressuring me for months, playing on my loneliness and disappointment about James's absence from family gatherings. She's very subtle about it, never directly criticizing him, just making little comments about reliability and commitment that add up over time. But today, I received his article about the pharmaceutical scandal. Front page of The Guardian, exposing how major companies have been suppressing safety data about drugs prescribed to elderly patients. My son is exactly the man I raised him to be. He fights for justice, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't pay well. Charlotte fights only for herself and her own interests. I had to put the journal down and walk to the window, staring out at the garden where father had taught me to identify different types of birds. My vision was blurry with tears I didn't want to shed. I've instructed Mr. Pemberton to prepare a new will, the entry continued, splitting everything equally between my children, with an additional provision for a journalism scholarship fund in James's name. But I must be careful. Charlotte has keys to this house and has been going through my papers when she thinks I'm not aware. I suspect she's been reading my correspondence with my solicitor. I need to protect James's inheritance without alerting her to my plans. The final entry was dated just 1 week before father's death. Mr. Pemberton was supposed to bring the new will by yesterday, but he cancelled our appointment due to illness. Charlotte seemed unusually interested in why he was coming. I'm worried that she somehow knows about my intentions. She's been asking pointed questions about my estate planning, suggesting that maybe I should wait until after the holidays to make any major changes. Something in her manner makes me uneasy. If anything happens to me before I can finalize these changes, I hope James will find this journal and understand that my final will doesn't reflect my true feelings about my son. The journal entries painted a clear picture. Father had been planning to restore my inheritance, recognizing that I'd been following the values he'd instilled in me, but Charlotte had been intercepting his communications and manipulating the situation to prevent any changes that would threaten her position. I rushed to Mr. Pemberton's office that afternoon, journal clutched in my hands like evidence at a crime scene. But when I arrived, his elderly secretary informed me with genuine sadness that Mr. Pemberton had suffered a massive heart attack the day after father's funeral and was currently in intensive care at the hospital. Very sudden it was, she said, shaking her grey head. He seemed fine at the funeral, spoke very fondly of your father. Then the next morning, he collapsed in his office. All his active files have been transferred to his partner, Mr. Davies, who's currently on holiday in Spain for his daughter's wedding. Won't be back for another 2 weeks, I'm afraid. Standing in that empty office, clutching father's journal, I realized the full scope of Charlotte's manipulation. She hadn't just influenced father against me, she'd orchestrated the entire situation, ensuring that any evidence of his final wishes would be buried in legal red tape and administrative delays until it was too late to matter. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Mr. Pemberton's heart attack the day after revealing a will that gave Charlotte everything she wanted, just weeks after father had planned to change that same will to include me equally. Do you think some people are born manipulative, or do they learn it through years of practice and refinement? Because what I was beginning to suspect about my sister made me question everything I thought I knew about the family I'd grown up in. I spent the next week playing detective in my own family's life, using every investigative skill I'd learned during my journalism career. Father's journal had given me dates, names, and specific incidents to investigate. If Charlotte had been systematically manipulating our father and stealing from him, there would be evidence, paper trails, witnesses, inconsistencies that would reveal the truth. The breakthrough came when I visited Mrs. Henderson, father's neighbor of 30 years who lived in the cottage next door. She was a retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes and an excellent memory for detail, exactly the kind of witness every journalist dreams of finding. She invited me in for tea and sympathy, her small living room cluttered with photographs of grandchildren and ceramic figurines collected over decades of travel. The smell of Earl Grey and homemade biscuits filled the air as she settled into her favorite floral armchair. "I'm so sorry about your father, James," she said, pouring tea from a china set that had probably been her wedding gift. "He was such a good man, always ready to help with anything I needed. When my Arthur passed 5 years ago, your father mowed my lawn every week without being asked." "That sounds like him," I replied, accepting the delicate cup and saucer. "Mrs. Henderson, I wondered if you might have noticed anything unusual in the months before father died. Any changes in his routine, people coming and going at odd hours?" Her eyes brightened with the prospect of sharing information she'd clearly been storing up. "Well, now that you mention it, your Charlotte was there quite often those last few months, much more than usual, always arriving when your father was at his medical appointments, Tuesdays and Fridays, regular as clockwork." Medical appointments? This was news to me. Father had never mentioned any health problems during our phone conversations. "Oh yes, dear, he'd been seeing specialists in London about his heart condition. Started about 6 months before he passed. He was very discreet about it, didn't want to worry anyone, but I noticed the pattern. And that's when Charlotte would arrive, always with those big shopping bags from expensive stores." "Did you see her taking anything from the house?" Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted, becoming more cautious. "Well, I didn't want to speak ill of family, especially with your father barely in the ground, but since you're asking directly..." "Yes, I saw her leaving with several boxes on more than one occasion. When I asked her about it over the garden fence, she said she was helping him organize his important papers, putting them somewhere safe, she said, because his memory wasn't what it used to be." Safe. The irony was devastating. "Did she say where she was taking these papers?" "To her house," she said, "for safekeeping." She also mentioned that she was helping him with his banking and correspondence because his eyesight was failing. Very devoted daughter, I thought at the time. Mrs. Henderson paused, studying my face carefully. "But there's something else, James. Something that's been bothering me since the funeral." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "The day before your father died, I saw Charlotte's car in the driveway very early in the morning, before 7 it was, because I was up feeding the birds. She was there for hours, and when she left, she had more boxes. But your father's car wasn't there. He was supposed to be at his appointment with the heart specialist in London." The timeline was beginning to form a clearer picture. Charlotte had been systematically removing documents from father's house, timing her visits to coincide with his medical appointments when she knew he'd be away for hours. Armed with this information, I contacted father's doctor, Dr. Morrison, who'd known our family for decades. Getting medical information about a deceased patient required some delicate negotiation. But Dr. Morrison had watched me grow up and was genuinely concerned about the family's well-being. "Your father's heart condition was manageable with medication," he told me during a private conversation in his office. "Not immediately life-threatening, but it required monitoring and lifestyle adjustments. He was actually responding well to treatment." "How was his mental state? Any signs of confusion or memory problems?" Dr. Morrison looked genuinely puzzled. "Quite the opposite, actually. Your father was sharp as a tack right until the end. No signs of dementia or cognitive decline whatsoever. His memory was excellent, his reasoning clear. In fact, he seemed particularly focused during his last few visits. Kept talking about making things right with his son, said he had some important changes to make before it was too late." "Did he mention changing his will specifically?" "Several times. He was quite concerned about it, actually." said he'd made some mistakes in his estate planning based on incomplete information, and he needed to correct them urgently. He seemed worried that time was running out. I also visited Father's bank, where the manager, Mr. Thompson, had known our family for over 20 years. While he couldn't provide specific account details without proper authorization, he was able to confirm that there had been unusual activity on Father's accounts in the months before his death. Several withdrawals that seemed out of character, he admitted reluctantly. Your father was normally very methodical about his banking, kept detailed records, but these withdrawals were sporadic, and when we called to confirm them as part of our security protocols, he seemed confused about some of them. What kind of amounts are we talking about? Nothing huge individually. 500 here, 800 there. Amounts that wouldn't trigger our larger withdrawal protocols, but they added up over time. Perhaps £15,000 total over the course of 8 months. £15,000. Enough to explain Charlotte's recent expensive purchases, her upgraded wardrobe, the costly renovations I'd noticed at her house during the funeral reception. The most damning evidence came from Father's email account, which I still had access to from years ago when I'd helped him set up his first computer. He'd never been comfortable with technology and had asked me to maintain his passwords and help him with technical problems during my visits home. Buried in his deleted items folder were draft emails to Mr. Pemberton, clearly outlining his intention to split his estate equally between Charlotte and me. The drafts were detailed, showing he'd put considerable thought into the decision. Dear Mr. Pemberton, I need to revise my will immediately. I've been influenced by one child's constant presence to overlook the other child's contributions to society and adherence to the values I tried to instill. James may be physically absent, but he's living the life of integrity and purpose that I raised him to embrace. Charlotte's devotion to me personally is admirable, but her attitude toward her brother and her increasingly materialistic concerns worry me. I want to split everything equally and establish a scholarship fund for young journalists in James's name. But these emails had never been sent. Instead, I found evidence that someone had been logging into his account and deleting his correspondence with his solicitor. The computer logs showed access from an IP address that I recognized. I'd helped Charlotte set up her boutique's website years earlier and remembered the specific numerical sequence. She'd been reading his emails, intercepting his communications with Mr. Pemberton, and ensuring that any attempts to change his will would be sabotaged before they could be finalized. I sat in Father's empty study, surrounded by the evidence of my sister's systematic betrayal, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just anger or hurt, but a cold, calculating determination to expose the truth and set things right. Charlotte had played a long game, manipulating everyone around her with surgical precision, using their emotions and expectations against them. She'd isolated Father from me, stolen his money, intercepted his legal correspondence, and orchestrated his final will reading to ensure maximum emotional impact. But she'd made one crucial mistake in her elaborate scheme. She'd underestimated her black sheep brother's investigative skills and his commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be for the family. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been deceiving you for years? The betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger's lie because it forces you to question every interaction, every shared moment, every expression of love or care that might have been calculated manipulation. The family gathering I organized 3 weeks later was supposedly to discuss dividing Father's personal belongings and handling the practical matters that follow any death. I'd called it under the pretense of wanting to ensure Mum was comfortable with the arrangements and that nothing important was overlooked in the probate process. Charlotte arrived precisely on time, wearing another expensive outfit, a tailored navy dress with matching jacket that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her confidence was unshakable, radiating from her like heat from a furnace. She'd clearly put considerable thought into her appearance, choosing clothing that projected success, respectability, and the kind of polish that comes from financial security. Mum was there too, looking frail and uncertain in her widow's weeds, still processing the double blow of losing her husband and discovering that her children were more divided than she'd ever realized. Uncle Robert had driven over from his farm in Derbyshire, along with Aunt Helen and several family friends who'd known Father for decades, Mrs. Whitmore from the church committee, Mr. Peterson, who'd worked with Father for 20 years, and the Reverend Collins, who'd conducted the funeral service. I'd spent those 3 weeks consulting with a different solicitor, one who specialized in will contests and estate fraud cases. Sarah Mitchell was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd built her reputation on exposing family manipulation and financial abuse. The evidence I'd gathered was compelling, she'd assured me, but Charlotte would undoubtedly fight any challenge with every resource at her disposal. The key, Sarah had explained, is getting her to reveal her knowledge and methods in front of witnesses. People like your sister rely on operating in shadows, controlling information, and manipulating situations without leaving obvious fingerprints. If we can force her into the light, her careful facade will crumble. I'd arranged the room carefully, positioning chairs so that Charlotte would be facing the window where the afternoon light would highlight every micro-expression. I'd also installed a recording app on my phone and placed it strategically on the table, hidden among Father's personal effects that were supposedly the reason for our gathering. "Before we start sorting through Father's belongings," I announced, once everyone was settled with tea and biscuits, "I found something whilst packing his books that I think everyone should see." I placed Father's leather journal on the table, along with carefully organized printouts of the deleted emails, bank records showing the suspicious withdrawals, and copies of the computer access logs that proved someone had been monitoring his electronic communications. Charlotte's face went pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup, but she maintained her composure with impressive self-control. Years of manipulation had taught her to mask her reactions, to present whatever face the situation required. "James, what is this melodrama about?" she asked, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice, the tiny crack in her confident facade. "We're here to discuss practical matters, not to rake over old grievances about Father's will. He made his choices, and we need to respect them. It's about justice, Charlotte, something you thought you could steal along with my inheritance." I began reading selected passages from Father's journal aloud, watching as the faces around the table shifted from confusion to shock to disgust. When I reached the entries about Charlotte's systematic manipulation and the mysterious disappearance of important documents, Mum actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his military bearing making him an imposing figure even in civilian clothes. "What exactly are you suggesting, James?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts based on documented evidence." I spread the papers across the table like a prosecutor presenting a case. "Charlotte has been stealing from Father for years, manipulating him emotionally and interfering with his legal communications to ensure she inherited everything." "These are lies," Charlotte said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "James is bitter about the will reading. He's fabricating evidence because he can't accept that Father chose the daughter who was actually present in his life over the son who abandoned him for his precious career." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to make the entire room uncomfortable. Several people shifted in their chairs, clearly torn between sympathy for my position and recognition that I had been largely absent from Father's final years. That's when I played my trump card. I'd prepared for this moment carefully, knowing that Charlotte's greatest strength, her ability to manipulate people through careful words and calculated emotions, could also be her weakness if I could get her to speak freely. "Actually, Charlotte, let me play something for everyone." I pressed play on the recording I'd made during the will reading, her whispered words coming through crystal clear. You're not getting anything." The room fell silent as her voice filled the space, cold and satisfied, lacking any trace of the grief or surprise that should have characterized such a moment. "The interesting thing about that statement," I continued, "is that it was said before Mr. Pemberton had even begun reading the will. How did you know what was in it, Charlotte? How could you be so certain about the contents unless you'd already ensured that the real will, the one Father actually wanted, would never see the light of day?" The room erupted in voices, everyone talking at once. Uncle Robert stood up and pointed an accusing finger at Charlotte, his face flushed with anger. "Margaret, did you know about any of this?" Mum was crying now, real tears this time, not the carefully managed grief she'd displayed at the funeral. "Charlotte, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't manipulate your own father, that you didn't steal from him while he was ill." But Charlotte's carefully constructed mask was finally beginning to slip. The perfect daughter facade was crumbling, revealing something cold and calculating underneath, something that had been hidden for years behind smiles and Sunday dinners and dutiful visits. "He was going to give everything to James," she shouted, her voice cracking with years of suppressed resentment. "After all I'd done, all the years I spent caring for him while his precious son was off playing journalist in exotic locations. I was the one who drove him to medical appointments, who managed his medications, who listened to him complain about his ungrateful son who never called." The confession hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating every relationship in the room. "I deserved that inheritance," she continued, her voice rising to nearly a shriek. "I earned it through years of sacrifice and dedication while James was living his selfish dream of being some kind of crusading reporter. Father was going to throw that all away because of one newspaper article, one moment of pride in his absent son. So you decided to take matters into your own hands," I said quietly, letting her words speak for themselves. "I protected what was rightfully mine. I made sure Father saw the truth about his children, which one was reliable, which one was present, which one deserved to inherit everything he'd worked for." The room was completely silent now, except for Mum's quiet sobbing and the tick of the grandfather clock marking time like a funeral drumbeat. Reverend Collins, who'd known our family since Charlotte and I were children, spoke first. "Charlotte, do you understand what you're admitting to? You're describing fraud, theft, and emotional manipulation of a vulnerable elderly man." "I'm describing justice," she replied, but her voice was hollow now, drained of its earlier conviction. "James abandoned this family years ago. He made his choice to prioritize his career over his relationships. I simply ensured that Father's final wishes reflected reality." 6 months later, after a legal battle that exposed every sordid detail of Charlotte's fraud and made headlines in the local newspaper, the original will was overturned by the court. Father's true final wishes, documented in his journal and draft correspondence, were honored, an equal split between his children, with the additional clause I'd never known about, a donation to establish a journalism scholarship fund in my name at the local university. Charlotte lost everything in the legal proceedings. The inheritance she'd fought so hard to secure was stripped away. Her boutique failed when the scandal destroyed her reputation in the small community, and her marriage to Richard collapsed when he realized the extent of her deception and manipulation. The barrister who'd built his career on integrity couldn't handle being associated with someone who'd systematically defrauded her own father. She moved away from the village 6 months after the court ruling, and we haven't spoken since. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd found work in a department store in a city where nobody knew her history, living in a small flat and struggling to rebuild a life shattered by her own choices. I used part of my restored inheritance to establish the Robert Harold Matthews Foundation for investigative journalism, helping young reporters pursue stories that matter, stories that hold powerful people accountable, stories that make a difference in the world. Father would have been proud, I think, to see his money supporting the kind of work he'd raised me to value. The fishing rod sits in my study now, next to Father's first edition books and the framed newspaper clipping of the pharmaceutical investigation that had convinced him to change his will back in my favor. I never did learn to fish properly. Father and I had run out of time for those lessons, but I kept the equipment as a reminder that some inheritances aren't about money or property. They're about understanding who you really are, what you stand for, and having the courage to fight for what's right, even when your own family stands against you. They're about recognizing that presence isn't always about physical proximity. Sometimes it's about carrying forward the values and principles that truly matter. Sometimes justice doesn't come with fanfare or dramatic courtroom scenes like in the movies. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of truth finally surfacing and family bonds being honored the way they should have been all along. Sometimes it comes through the painful process of discovering that the people you thought you knew best were strangers wearing familiar faces. The hardest part wasn't losing Charlotte as a sister. Our relationship had been built on childhood memories and family obligation rather than genuine understanding or affection. The hardest part was realizing how much pain Father had endured in his final months, caught between his love for both his children and his growing awareness that one of them was systematically manipulating him. If stories like this one move you, if they make you think about your own family relationships and the complex dynamics that shape our lives, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Have you discovered that someone you trusted was deceiving you? Have you learned that sometimes the people who seem most devoted are actually the most manipulative? I read every single comment, and your stories matter just as much as mine. We're all trying to navigate the complicated waters of family loyalty, personal integrity, and the courage to stand up for truth even when it's painful. Sometimes the most important inheritances can't be measured in pounds and pence. They're measured in the strength to do what's right, no matter the cost.